Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and today we're diving deep into the psychological and neurobiological mechanisms that trap people with chronic fatigue syndrome in cycles they feel powerless to escape. What we're uncovering challenges everything we thought we knew about willpower, self control, and recovery from chronic illness. The research reveals that chronic fatigue syndrome isn't just about being tired, and it's certainly not about lacking motivation or discipline. Instead, it's about specific brain circuits that become dysregulated, creating a cascade of psychological and physiological processes that make recovery incredibly difficult without understanding the underlying mechanisms. Let me start with something that might surprise you. The research shows that people with chronic fatigue syndrome often develop what looks like hypervigilance to their own internal states. They become exquisitely tuned to every fluctuation in energy, every symptom change, every bodily sensation that might signal improvement or decline. On the surface, this monitoring seems adaptive. After all, shouldn't you pay attention to your body's signals? But the neuroscience research reveals a troubling paradox. This constant internal monitoring actually becomes a cognitive load that perpetuates symptom escalation. Here's how this works neurologically. Sustained monitoring of internal states requires ongoing cognitive effort, consuming what researchers call cognitive resources. When these resources are depleted through constant symptom surveillance, less capacity remains for other mental tasks, creating what's essentially a feedback loop where monitoring for fatigue symptoms actually increases the perception and severity of those symptoms. The brain imaging studies show increased prefrontal cortex activation during fatigue states, reflecting the extraneural effort required for this monitoring and control. But this heightened brain activation is itself fatiguing, creating a neurological catch-22 where the act of trying to manage symptoms becomes part of what maintains them. This connects to broader research on cognitive load and mental fatigue. When cognitive resources are consumed by self-monitoring, individuals become more susceptible to what researchers call reduced inhibitory control. The brain's ability to suppress irrelevant information becomes impaired. This means intrusive thoughts about symptoms become harder to dismiss, heightening symptom awareness and creating escalation. But the hypervigilance pattern is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The research reveals that chronic fatigue syndrome involves fundamental disruptions in multiple brain networks that normally work together to regulate energy, motivation, and activity. One of the most significant findings involves what's called the default mode network, a collection of brain regions that become active during rest and introspection. In healthy individuals, this network quiets down when they engage in tasks, allowing focused attention and cognitive performance. But in chronic fatigue syndrome, researchers have identified a pattern of default mode network overactivation during rest periods. Instead of providing restoration, rest becomes associated with increased mental fatigue, rumination, and what the research calls crash risk. Here's what this looks like neurologically. The brain regions involved in self-referential thinking, worry, and negative rumination remain hyperactive even during periods meant for recovery. This creates what researchers describe as inflexible negative affect. The brain gets stuck in patterns of negative thinking that prevent genuine rest and restoration. The default mode network research helps explain why many people with chronic fatigue syndrome report that their minds feel busy, even when they're physically resting. The brain isn't actually recovering during downtime. Instead, it's engaging in the kind of mental activity that increases rather than decreases fatigue. This neurological pattern contributes to what researchers call post-rest crashes, the phenomenon where people feel worse rather than better after periods of rest. The brain's recovery systems aren't functioning properly, so rest doesn't provide the restoration it should. Moving deeper into the neurobiology, the research reveals disruptions in what's called the mesocorticolimbic dopamine system, brain circuits involving areas like the ventral tegmental area nucleus accumbens, and prefrontal cortex. These circuits are crucial for motivation, reward anticipation, and what researchers call energy budgeting. When these dopamine pathways are disrupted, two critical functions become impaired: the ability to anticipate rewards and the capacity to allocate energy appropriately for daily cognitive tasks. This isn't about lacking willpower or motivation in any psychological sense. It's about literal changes in brain chemistry that affect how the neural systems responsible for goal directed behavior function. The reward anticipation research shows that people with chronic fatigue syndrome have blunted neural responses to reward cues. This manifests as diminished motivation, reduced engagement in previously rewarding activities, and what researchers call anhedonia, the loss of pleasure or interest in activities that were once enjoyable. But perhaps more importantly for understanding the boom bust cycle, these dopamine disruptions impair energy budgeting, the brain's ability to accurately assess energy costs and benefits when deciding whether to engage in activities. This leads to poor cost benefit decision making and difficulty sustaining attention or effortful activity. The research shows that people with chronic fatigue syndrome often experience what looks like good days, where they feel more energetic and motivated. But the disrupted dopamine signaling means their brains can't accurately predict the energy costs of activities, leading to overexertion that triggers subsequent crashes. This brings us to one of the most insidious aspects of chronic fatigue syndrome: the role of internalized stigma in undermining self regulation. Research reveals that when people adopt negative societal beliefs about their illness, thinking they're weak, lazy, or not trying hard enough, this internalized stigma creates additional psychological burden that makes self regulation even more difficult. The stigma research shows several specific mechanisms through which this occurs. First, internalized stigma is linked to what researchers call psychological inflexibility, reduced ability to adapt responses based on changing circumstances. This makes it harder to pace activities appropriately during periods of increased energy. Second, stigma is associated with lower self efficacy and reduced ability to engage in what researchers call committed action, sustained goal directed behavior. During boom periods, this manifests as difficulty maintaining balanced activity levels, leading to either overcompensation or avoidance. Third, internalized stigma increases emotional dysregulation, which erodes self control and decision making during times when energy levels fluctuate. The research shows this creates a pattern of chronic resource depletion. The psychological resources needed for self regulation become consistently overwhelmed. The brain imaging research adds another layer to this understanding. Studies show that people with chronic fatigue syndrome have altered connectivity in brain networks involved in what's called interoception, that to accurately sense internal bodily signals. Specifically, there are disruptions in prediction error signaling in regions like the insula and anterior cingulate cortex. These areas normally help the brain compare expected bodily states with actual sensory input and adjust behavior accordingly. When this system is disrupted, there's a mismatch between perceived energy levels and actual physiological capacity. The research describes this as interoceptive insensitivity. Real changes in bodily energy aren't accurately sensed, so appropriate responses like rest or pacing are delayed or absent. This creates situations where subjective energy may remain high even as physiological reserves are depleted, setting up inevitable crashes. This interoceptive dysfunction is part of a broader pattern the research calls allostatic dysregulation. Allostasis refers to the body's ability to achieve stability through change, essentially, the capacity to adjust physiological systems based on environmental demands. In chronic fatigue syndrome, this regulatory system becomes inflexible or overloaded. The brain's ability to predict energy needs and regulate behavior accordingly becomes compromised, leading to what researchers describe as maladaptive goal maintenance during boom phases. Instead of the flexible adjustment of activity levels that healthy allostatic regulation would provide, people get stuck in rigid patterns of either overexertion or complete withdrawal. The biological systems that should provide automatic regulation of energy expenditure are no longer functioning properly. The learned helplessness research provides yet another piece of this complex puzzle. Studies show that chronic fatigue syndrome involves specific changes in brain circuits connecting the dorsal raphe nucleus and medial prefrontal cortex, areas involved in responses to controllable versus uncontrollable stress. When these circuits are disrupted, the brain defaults to what researchers call behavioral passivity and diminished motivation. This isn't learned helplessness in the psychological sense, but rather represents the brain's unconditioned response to prolonged uncontrollable stress. The medial prefrontal cortex normally detects and encodes behavioral control, inhibiting the dorsal raphe nucleus to reduce passivity and promote adaptive responses. But chronic stress can impair this regulatory capacity, sustaining helplessness like states that are closely linked to persistent fatigue and low energy. This creates a neurobiological foundation for the psychological experience of feeling powerless to influence symptoms or recovery, even when behavioral interventions might be helpful. The research also reveals disruptions in what's called the fear avoidance system. Initially, avoiding activities that trigger symptoms is adaptive. It allows the nervous system to recover. But over time, this avoidance can become generalized and habitual, extending to activities that are actually safe and potentially beneficial. The neuroscience shows that avoidance serves a dual function. It provides temporary relief from anxiety about symptoms, but it also prevents the brain from learning that many activities are actually safe. Without opportunities to test assumptions about what's manageable, fear based beliefs become entrenched and often intensify. This creates what researchers call a bidirectional relationship between fear and avoidance. Fear leads to avoidance, which maintains fear by preventing experiences that could disconfirm threat beliefs. Over time, the fear response becomes conditioned to broader categories of activities, creating increasingly restrictive lifestyles. But perhaps most concerning is how these various mechanisms interact to create what the research describes as self reinforcing cycles. The hypervigilance increases cognitive load, which worsens fatigue, which increases monitoring, which increases load. The disrupted dopamine signaling impairs energy budgeting, leading to overexertion, which triggers crashes, which further disrupts reward processing. The internalized stigma reduces psychological flexibility, making appropriate pacing more difficult, leading to boom bust cycles, which seem to confirm negative beliefs about capability, which increases stigma. Each system feeds into the others, creating what researchers call multi level maintenance of dysfunction. Importantly, the research also identifies how traditional approaches to chronic fatigue syndrome might inadvertently reinforce some of these patterns. Simply telling someone to pace better or think more positively doesn't address the underlying neurobiological disruptions that make such advice difficult to implement. Similarly, focusing solely on rest without addressing the hypervigilance and rumination patterns might actually worsen default mode network overactivation. And emphasizing symptom monitoring without understanding cognitive load effects could increase rather than decrease the factors that perpetuate fatigue. But the research also points toward more effective intervention approaches. Mindfulness based interventions show promise for reducing emotional distress in chronic illness populations, though direct research in chronic fatigue syndrome is still limited. The mechanisms appear to involve enhanced attentional control, increased present moment awareness, and reduced experiential avoidance. These changes help individuals manage negative emotions and reduce the impact of distress during symptom flares. Critically, mindfulness approaches that reduce rumination and default mode network overactivation might help restore the brain's capacity for genuine rest and recovery. This is different from simply resting more. It's about changing the quality of mental activity during rest periods. The research on prediction error signaling suggests that interventions targeting interoceptive accuracy might help restore appropriate energy sensing and behavioral regulation. This involves learning to distinguish between accurate bodily signals and the brain's sometimes faulty predictions about energy availability. Some promising approaches involve gradual exposure to carefully calibrated activities while learning to accurately assess energy costs and recovery needs. This isn't about pushing through symptoms, but rather about retraining disrupted prediction systems through systematic supported practice. The allostatic regulation research points toward interventions that restore flexible responding to internal and external demands. This might involve techniques that help the nervous system shift more fluidly between activation and recovery states rather than getting stuck in chronic patterns of either hyperactivation or shutdown. The dopamine system research suggests that interventions supporting appropriate reward processing and motivation might help restore more accurate energy budgeting. This could involve strategies that provide predictable positive experiences while gradually building tolerance for sustained goal directed activity. But perhaps most importantly, the multi level nature of these mechanisms suggests that effective interventions need to address multiple systems simultaneously. Biological interventions that support cellular energy production, psychological interventions that address fear avoidance and cognitive patterns, and social interventions that reduce stigma and provide appropriate support. The research makes clear that chronic fatigue syndrome isn't a problem of individual weakness or inadequate effort. It's a complex condition involving measurable changes in brain structure and function, neurotransmitter systems, stress response networks, and energy regulation mechanisms. Understanding these mechanisms doesn't minimize the reality of the condition, it validates it while pointing toward more effective approaches to support and recovery. The brain changes that occur in chronic fatigue syndrome are real and significant, but they're also potentially modifiable through appropriate interventions. This research also highlights the importance of addressing internalized stigma and societal misunderstanding of chronic fatigue syndrome. When people blame themselves for their symptoms or believe they should be able to overcome the condition through willpower alone, they're fighting against neurobiological realities that make such approaches ineffective and potentially harmful. The hypervigilance research suggests that well meaning advice to listen to your body needs to be more nuanced. While interoceptive awareness is important, the constant monitoring that often develops in chronic fatigue syndrome becomes counterproductive. Learning when and how to attend to bodily signals versus when to redirect attention elsewhere becomes a crucial skill. The default mode network research reveals why traditional rest recommendations might be insufficient. If the brain remains active in rumination and self referential thinking during rest periods, physical inactivity doesn't translate to neural recovery. Techniques that genuinely quiet mental activity during rest become essential. This understanding also explains why many people with chronic fatigue syndrome report feeling guilty about resting or struggle with the psychological aspects of being inactive. If rest periods are accompanied by increased rumination and negative self referential thinking, rest itself becomes associated with distress rather than recovery. The research on boom bust cycles reveals why these patterns can feel so compelling and difficult to change. During boom phases, disrupted dopamine signaling creates genuine feelings of increased energy and motivation, but the underlying energy budgeting problems mean these feelings don't accurately reflect actual capacity. The neurobiological changes that create boom periods are real. People aren't imagining feeling better, but the brain systems that should regulate activity based on actual energy availability aren't functioning properly, leading to overexertion that triggers crashes. Understanding this helps reduce self blame around boom bust patterns while pointing toward interventions that address the underlying prediction and regulation problems rather than simply trying to override them through willpower. The fear avoidance research also provides a more nuanced understanding of activity restriction in chronic fatigue syndrome. Some activity limitation is necessary and appropriate given real energy constraints. But when avoidance becomes generalized or driven by catastrophic predictions rather than accurate assessment of actual limitations, it can become part of what maintains dysfunction. Learning to distinguish between appropriate activity modification and problematic avoidance requires understanding individual patterns and gradually testing assumptions about what's manageable versus what's genuinely harmful. As we think about supporting people with chronic fatigue syndrome, this research emphasizes the importance of validation alongside appropriate intervention. The neurobiological changes are real and significant. The symptoms aren't imagined or exaggerated. The difficulty with energy regulation, motivation, and activity pacing reflects genuine brain circuit disruptions, not personal failings. At the same time, understanding these mechanisms opens up possibilities for interventions that work with rather than against the affected systems. Instead of fighting neurobiological realities, effective approaches help restore more adaptive functioning in the circuits that have become dysregulated. This might involve supporting cellular energy production through targeted nutritional or medical interventions, while simultaneously addressing the psychological patterns that have developed in response to energy limitations. It might involve retraining interoceptive accuracy while providing tools for managing hypervigilance and rumination. Most importantly, it involves recognizing chronic fatigue syndrome as a complex medical condition requiring comprehensive, individualized approaches rather than simple advice or generic treatment protocols. The research we've explored today represents a fundamental shift in understanding chronic fatigue syndrome from a vague, poorly understood condition to one with specific, measurable neurobiological mechanisms. This understanding doesn't provide simple solutions, but it does offer hope for more effective, targeted interventions. This has been Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and thank you for joining me today.